Hi, this is Steve Hargadon and Audrey Waters, and we are not live, but recorded on the 6th of July, 2012, to talk about Audrey's posts for Hack Education this week. How did ISTE come up again?
Uh, well, I found myself wanting to answer some questions based on, based on what was happening in social media around, particularly on Twitter, and ran into a bunch of problems with what's becoming a theme, I think, for me lately, this issue of data portability. But actually, the way that Twitter is structured, it's impossible for me, or nearly impossible for me, very difficult for me to go back in time and reconstruct everything that was tweeted with the ISTE12 hashtag.
And why is that?
Um, Twitter has restricted the length of time in which you can actually search. So even if you use their search interface, you can only pull so much history, a very limited amount of history, and only a week's worth. So if I were to search for the ISTE12 hashtag today, I would only find the things that were tweeted all the way up through last Friday, which of course, is 3 days after ISTE ended. And so the alternative that Twitter has given us is that they actually offer, you can buy your tweets, you can buy the history of Twitter from these resellers, which doesn't seem like a very satisfactory answer, particularly as a journalist or for people who are doing research.
So we're at this weird moment where a commercial company's offering
Mhm.
feels more like a public good.
Right. It is. I mean, it's really interesting because I think that Twitter's in this sort of in between space where it is a technology company, but it also feels in some ways like a media company, or certainly, people. Twitter is a place where news is broken. It's a good place to sort of keep up to date on not just what people are writing about in blogs, but what people are publishing in newspapers and magazines, what's on television. And so it's hard to know. I think as a user of Twitter, sort of how to approach this problem. And I think it's particularly challenging too when you've invested as I have invested a lot of energy into Twitter to find that you can't even actually export your own Twitter data. I mean, you can pull all of your data out of Facebook, but you cannot actually pull all of your own tweets out of Twitter.
This reminds me of when Ning went to a paid model because, you know, the content that we contribute, do we own it or does the company own it?
Well, the
And when
licensing says we
when
do, but we don't.
well, what Ning did was they said, if you don't pay money now, we're going to shut your sites down, not just
Right.
archive them or make them static, but we're actually going to take the content away. And it feels very much like Twitter has done the same kind of a breaking of the social contract
Yes.
that I don't actually own the tweets that I made.
Right. I mean, and I think I think that there's that the licensing says that we do, but there is actually no way for us to pull out our own data, which I think is really troubling. Particularly if you have invested a lot of energy into the content that you create there. And I think that back in 2010, Twitter made this grand gesture of handing over its archive to the Library of Congress. I think an early recognition that this was a historical record, that Twitter contained a historical record of some importance. And the Library of Congress is still struggling for a number of reasons, both sort of legal and technology reasons, to make that information accessible to scholars, let alone to the general public, and let alone to journalists. Really, I just wanted to answer what was, I thought, in some ways, a great and important question that Dean Sharesky asked, which was, what percentage of ISTE attendees tweeted? I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Teachers' use of Twitter, the the importance of Twitter for people developing their own learning networks. And it's a shame, I think, that we can't easily conduct research on such an important tool that we're using.
It's interesting. There is actually really practical value in knowing how many tweets come out of a formal presentation session
Mm-hmm.
because it helps you to gauge the technology level of the audience.
Yes. And I mean, I was curious too. I was curious about how many things were tweeted. What were the popular themes from Twitter? And is that a different audience than sort of the conference assessments of the conference overall? I was very curious to look at sort of the sentiment on Twitter, particularly to the opening keynote, which, as we noted last week, seemed sort of like a big advertisement for Texas Instruments and Qualcomm. And and I was also curious to be able to map some of the connections between the connections that people have through their Twitter networks. So there's a lot of really interesting things that we could discover, and I think it's just unfortunate is a nice way to put it. I think it's rather sad that Twitter now, the only way to access a lot of this is to actually pay for access to something that really we're doing publicly in the open, and now we're being sort of charged to get access to our own archives.
So it would be comparable to the blogging platforms saying you have to pay to see your own blogs or anybody else's after a week.
Or I think of it akin to sort of the way in which you can go to a library and access, archives to the very beginning of the New York Times, for example. And it would be a shame to walk into the library and say, well, you're not a subscriber to the New York Times, so I'm afraid you can't look at this historical record.
There's been a lot of really interesting discussion, or there was a few years ago, of the advent of radio
Hmm.
and how it had this same sort of empowering feeling of anybody could be a radio operator. It was this great new technology that over the course of time became, there was an inevitable power shift
Yes.
toward corporations. Are there things inherently different about the web, or are we actually going to continue to see these kinds of shifts in power?
I think that's a really great question, and I think about this a lot in terms of some of the practices, particularly the business practices that we've seen adopted on the web that really do echo back to back to questions around the media. They echo some of the business practices of offline of pre-internet technology. So I think about the pressure to have advertising, the pressures to think about subscription and advertise-based models, and I think that's something that Twitter seems to be adopting as well. And I do think that this is an opportunity to rethink both the business and the power relations, but certainly these technologies do tend to adopt the things that have worked for television, the things that have worked for radio before that, the things that worked for newspaper before that. And so I'm not sure if the potential for change, if that's really actualized.
Well, we live within contexts,
Hmm.
and there are ways of thinking about monetizing or having a business be profitable for those who've invested in them. There are also going to be pressures, sort of natural pressures, that are part of how financial markets work. But I've been awfully proud of how Twitter's responded to some of the political requests for
Yes.
records and the like. So this feels sort of intriguingly discouraging coming from Twitter.
Well, I think that this is very interesting because, and this is one of the things that I think puts Twitter in a complicated position because they really have embraced in some ways this notion of free speech, protecting, fighting for their users' rights. There was actually a law case decided this week when a Twitter user had his Twitter history subpoenaed in New York State, and Twitter fought the subpoena, saying that the government didn't have a warrant to search the records. And so in some ways Twitter has done a good job, but then again I think these business concerns come up, and Twitter has sort of has been I think taken a lot of heat for struggling to come up with a business model, and now it appears that they're adopting ones that really do look a lot more like the advertising industry, and and certainly don't have a lot of don't pretend well for users being able to access content as freely and openly as Twitter, I think, likes to suggest that it is.
I mean, I don't mean to dwell too long here on this Twitter story, but it also seems like we're getting hints that this sort of sense that an RSS feed that anybody can kind of pull data and create a way of looking at Twitter is actually also kind of under question.
Yeah, and I think that again, I think this is one of the things that makes us, or would make me want to encourage us all to really think carefully too about these questions of data portability, data ownership, controlling the words that you create. Partially because I think of seeing some of these things happen around Twitter with user generated content.
Okay, on to educational apps.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Number one, I loved them. Number two, no Android? Really?
I know. I know. It's comes back, I think, somewhat to these conversations that we were having last week around Google I/O, and it really does feel as though Android is an afterthought. If it's even an afterthought for the creators of educational apps. I still struggle to find folks who are Android first or even Android second. The process that I hear from a lot of startups now is that they'll make an iOS app, and then their next step is to make one that's HTML5 so that it can be accessed on any device.
I'm not blaming anybody. I
No, yeah.
understand that even with the sheer numbers of Android, it's the difficulty of the varieties of which version and which phone. I just was so sad. The cargo bot looked incredible.
CargoBot is one of my favorite apps right now, and a great one for, I think, for teaching some of the basics of computational thinking. And yeah, it is a shame that it's not available on other devices.
I can't wait until it is. And then, of course, the New York Public Library app for Frankenstein.
Yes, which was fabulous. This is the second app that the New York Public Library has made, that's going through some of their archives and collections and creating what I think is a really interesting experience. You think about the ways in which you wander the stacks in a library and can make all sorts of sort of wonderful discoveries based on what's next to a book on the bookshelf, and they've done a great job, I think, of creating an app that has a similar experience where you stumble upon things that you wouldn't otherwise uncover by thinking about the connections around Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is, she was fascinating. She was friends with many of the rock star poets and theorists of her day, and so it's a really great look at all sorts of literary history.
This is the change in book reading. It's one of the changes that actually really excite me, right? That feel like they are going to substantively enhance our experience. Just in the same way that I think when we figure out how to have the book become a platform for conversation, it will.
Yeah.
I'm much less interested in the kind of glitzy iPad book publishing than I am in something that gives such context and depth to a book.
I agree.
And building Legos in Chrome.
Yes, this is the time waster. I think this is a great. This is a partnership between, I think, Google's Australian office and Lego that have built a really great portal that you get the mat, you can access bricks, and you can build in your browser. Fun. I love Lego, so fun stuff.
Okay, my first reaction to the badging post was, are we really talking about this again? And then I was actually really glad you were.
Well, that's good. No, this is a story that's actually been weighing on me for a while now, and it's I've been thinking about it in terms of a number of the things that I'm seeing. It's not just the. I mean, we're seeing right now several pushes for recognizing informal learning, for highlighting or for creating sort of alternative credentialing platforms or processes. And I've just had this sort of this niggling feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right, and this was really not just not solving a problem, but perhaps a way, if we didn't move carefully, of exacerbating the problems that we already have with sort of folks who are degreed and credentialed and badged, and sort of actually raising the bar on the badging rather than, I think, opening access to more opportunities. And I was thinking about the study that came out of Georgetown that really looked at who benefits from certificates, and these are certificates given out by educational institutions, community colleges, 4-year schools, and they've found some really interesting discrepancies between who benefits and how much people benefit from pursuing these. And so I think it's just something to keep in mind when we push badges, particularly when we push them in the technology industry. That again, this is something that isn't necessarily going to solve problems, and it could actually exacerbate some of the inequalities that already exist.
I love that you made that connection. So certificates versus degrees, but then looking at certificates as they might relate to badges and what we could potentially learn.
Mm-hmm.
I also felt like you teased out an even bigger issue, which was who actually benefits from the whole concept of badging.
Yes.
And it occurred to me that the people who run the badging systems
Right.
have the most to gain.
Well, I think that this is precisely right. I mean, and this is the funny thing um, and I hope actually we'll talk about this again in relation to Khan Academy, but it's interesting to see how some things are positioned as being a force that's the underdog or the outsider or an alternative when really they're actually deeply implicated in the power structures that already exist. I was surprised to hear that actually certificates are the second most popular post-secondary award that's given. So certificates actually aren't a minor new edge case scenario. This is actually something that's pretty widespread. And I think that when we see now all of these forces coming in to create alternative, in quotes, certificate programs, that seems to be chasing the money that is certainly associated with again a sort of a way of sanctioning certain people with certain who've passed certain skills or certain tests, and I think it is sort of deeply implicated in the power structures that already exist.
You also bring out the idea that it benefits employers.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially, I'm assuming what you meant was that it's giving them another filtering system.
Yeah, yeah,
Was that what you meant?
yeah, no, and I think that I think that I think that employers, um, you know, employers have been in some ways some have argued that employers are reticent to look at some of these alternatives. But I just saw Udacity announced this week that they've had, gosh, now I can't remember if it was 20 or 50, but they've had a huge number of employers who've agreed that they will recognize the Udacity certificates. And again, this is just thinking about, really, I'm not sure that these are as marginal as some would suggest they are. These really do seem to be reinforcing reinforcing things that are already in place. And I do worry about that in the technology sector in particular, which particularly the way in which the Georgetown study highlighted that certificates benefit men far more than they benefit women.
I know we've said this before, but the radical thought that what if the measure of what you have done is what you've actually done?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But then I mean, comes back to sort of individual ownership and agency, and that's a harder thing for these other systems to monetize, right? If we all were showcasing our work on our own websites, that's that where are the business opportunities in that, Steve?
And I don't think you have to be feeling that the motivation there is necessarily evil. It's
No.
just that people are trying to find ways to make a living
Yep.
with what they do, and they're used to playing a certain role.
Yep.
Okay, so moving on to Learning Jar.
Yeah.
I thought that this line was really intriguing. Un- Unbundling education, but noticing that we're repackaging it elsewhere.
Right. I mean, again, this article, I certainly wrote having the previous one in mind, and I hear a lot of folks talking right now about the potential for technology to quote unbundle education, that it's going to separate out access to information, access to courses, the certificate granting part, the mentorship part, the networking part. But it feels as though, as I just said, it really feels as though although the deck is being reshuffled in some ways, that it's actually we're seeing some of the cards still, the cards still in the hands of or the cards that are powerful still in certain sectors' hands, and I do wonder about I do wonder how how all of this is going to shake out, particularly for folks, for adult learners in particular, who are looking for a leg up in this economy.
So I want to give you a chance to talk about what Learning Jar actually does. But there was one feature that I kept hoping that it did, and I couldn't tell.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to me that as a social learning tool, if other learners tell you where they felt like they learned best, that you would get this great crowdsourced capability of figuring out where the best places to go for different kinds of learning are. Is that the intent?
I think that's on the roadmap, as they say. I think that is the intent. So this site, although it's been sort of under construction for a year now, it really just opened up to the public this week. But that was sort of part of the initial ideas, that you could see, particularly for folks who took sort of who took paths outside the norm, people who didn't get a college degree in their or in a discipline in which they now work. If you could see the path that someone else took and learn from that, I think that is very useful. But as it stands currently, Learning Jar really hasn't built out those features. They've gone more to, they've sort of, at this stage, there really are just sort of an aggregation of places where you can learn skills online, and they tend to be these web development, web design skills.
And I get the impression that the portfolio versus education path tension isn't fully solved there.
Yeah, I don't think so either, and I feel as though this is, looking at a startup, in all fairness, that just launched this week. You can sort of even see that when you move through the site, that do you want to does the startup want to focus on helping people create a portfolio where they can showcase their own work, or do they want to be focused on highlighting different people's learning paths, or do they want to be a catalog where you can find where you can sort of see where folks have recommended what's the best place to learn Photoshop online. And I think that although all of those ideas might be connected, it'll be interesting to see which one Learning Jar moves forward with, in terms of building out the website.
If there were peer recommendations that aggregated in the same kind of way that Amazon makes recommendations. I think I'd be really excited about that.
I would be really excited. I mean, particularly if you could, if you could identify somebody who you look up to in your career, in your industry, in your field, whether and so someone you know or someone you don't know, to be able to sort of see what that person, if you could see what that person did or where that person learned, or even have some glimpse into what they liked or didn't like about the various processes, formal or informal education, I think that would be really interesting. And to see the endorsements or the review of certain, again, classes or conversations, I think is interesting. But I think that the challenge, I think, will be to get enough, to get enough usage of a site like that to actually make it useful. I mean, this is the thing, to build that recommendation engine on Amazon, that's a lot of data. And, I'm not sure how a startup would get that started.
I'm intrigued because I'm actually quite excited about it. Okay, so tell me the difference between snarkiness and satire.
I've been thinking about this a lot this week because this question of, I think it's a bit like the Supreme Court. Well, I think it was the Supreme Court justice who said sort of, "I know obscenity when I see it." Is that satire seems to be something that you laugh at, and snarkiness seems to be something that you wag your finger at, even though they could be the same joke. I think it just depends on how you see the joke. Some people told me that, or some people responded via Twitter to me that snarkiness just wants to criticize people, whereas satire actually offers constructive criticism. But that doesn't seem to me to be a fair assessment either. I think that if you look at probably the most popular satire right now is what the Colbert Report, and I'm not sure Stephen Colbert is offering any more of a sort of roadmap for the future of America than a snarky person is. So,
Well, in this post, you say that the MTT2K,
yes,
is the most interesting development in educational technology so far this year.
yes, I I I think that this is genius. I mean, it's fascinating. I've been covering and watching Khan Academy closely for, I guess, a couple of years now, and last year in particular, I don't think there was a newspaper or magazine or television show in this country that didn't feature at least one story really, really praising Sal Khan for being the future of education. And even though there have been lots of educators trying to offer some critiques of both the content, the pedagogy, the usage of the videos, really his story has, or the Khan Academy has sort of been unassailable. No one has really been able to sort of break the veneer that this is indeed the sort of the salvation of math education in this country, until along comes the Mystery Teacher Theater 2000 with a very low budget satire, offering their critique. And suddenly, because I think partially because of the use of humor, I've noticed just in the last couple of weeks, people really starting to have a more critical conversation about Khan Academy, recognizing the flaws in, again, in the content and in the pedagogy.
And clearly, there's a power story here based on how those who have been involved or promoting of Khan Academy have responded.
It's always interesting to see how things are framed, particularly when you critique somebody. And I believe it or not, I get this a lot. When you critique somebody who is a media darling, whether it's a company who's a media darling or a person who's a media darling, something that seems unquestionable, you it's interesting to see sort of who rises to the defense and how that defense is framed. And it was really interesting for me to see folks acting as though Khan Academy, which has received, I think, upwards of $20 million in funding. Like I said, has been showcased and lauded universally for what it's doing. That these teachers were being accused of bullying, of picking on Khan Academy. That to me seemed a really that seemed sort of the disproportionate with the amount of power and influence that Khan Academy wields and the connections that Khan Academy has utilized, to suggest that two math teachers were picking on him. It doesn't seem like the right that verb doesn't really seem to sort of match the power dynamics. I get accused of picking on Pearson, which is similarly ludicrous.
I actually think those definitions of snarkiness and satire are reversed.
Mm-hmm.
I think snarkiness offers constructive counterpoints,
Uh-huh.
whereas satire is just about finding fault and humor.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that part of it is tone. I think that I was looking for the sort of the etymology of the word snark, and all I could think of was a famous Lewis Carroll poem uh, about the snark, the hunt for the snark. Um, sometimes it doesn't help to have a literary background, um, but I think it's the snark is a portmanteau of snide remark, some suggest, and so there's something about snarkiness that is associated with being rude and, as Sal Khan said, disparaging, overly critical, and snark doesn't have the snark isn't necessarily seen as humorous.
So Saul mistook satire for snarkiness.
I I don't know. But it's been really interesting to watch Khan Academy's response to this as well. Again, written I've written about some of these critiques for a while now, and never never have I had any interactions. Never has Khan Academy ever reached out to me. Never have they sort of wanted to follow up or answer my requests for interviews, which is fine. I mean, that's fine. But it was interesting that this week they did. And so again, I think really, I mean, I really kudos to the Mystery Teacher Theater 2000 folks, because Khan Academy seems to be paying attention to these critiques more than any of the other tactics in the past. So, and I think that's really interesting. And I'm not sure what lessons teachers can draw from that, but it is fascinating to me to see that that's the way that humor and satire work.
It's also potentially an argument for the virality of video as a
Yes.
medium.
No, I think that is a good point. Um, as opposed to a rant on a blog. I think it's also interesting to see that the usage of a lot of folks who've made their videos have used Mozilla's Popcorn tool, which is a very simple web-based tool that allows you can enter a YouTube video URL and then create comments on top of it. So if again, there's something about the video format and the remixability of the video format that has made it pretty easy for folks to be able to create their own responses to Khan Academy here.
Okay, so let's go to the news.
Okay.
I was really delighted to see that two more states had received waivers for the
Yes.
No Child Left Behind because it allowed them to move away from the rigid top-down prescriptions for reform to other less rigid top-down prescriptions for reform.
Right. Right. The more than half the states now have received their waivers from the Department of Education, trading Bush policy for Obama policy. So
I didn't get to read the story, but I thought it was interesting. Delaware's passed a law giving students privacy protections about what they post online. That seemed like a really positive
this
development.
is a very positive development, and we've talked about a couple of court cases around this in the past with students getting in trouble for things that they've posted about their school lives online. And there is legal precedent that schools cannot punish students for things that they do offline. These date back to protests around the Vietnam War era, but the law is sort of lagging behind in what students can be punished for online. And so Delaware's come out in this case to say that schools cannot demand access to students' social media accounts, and they're really trying to institute some rights for students over what schools can and cannot use this material over. So this is good news, and hopefully it will extend not just to other states and their and schools, but also extend to sort of businesses as well.
There have been a lot of stories lately about the weaknesses of philanthrocapitalism. In an expose book on microfinance projects, and then a look at sort of the long-term effects of some of the large amounts of money that have been spent on what have been claimed to be successes in large-scale philanthropy, but have not been, or at least are arguably more complex than the stories that are told. Why is there so much money going into the chartered school movement?
That's a good. I mean, I think that there are a number of reasons for that. I think that for a lot of folks will argue that charter schools provide a place for schools to experiment with things that the bureaucracies in place do not allow. And so I think that some really do see charter schools as really sort of innovative test beds that the normal public school system can't and won't encourage. I think it's more complicated than that, in part because many of these charter schools are run by for-profit networks, and so and there does seem to be a lot of interest in sort of creating products that those charter schools will buy. So I think it's and I think it also ties into sort of many charter schools, although not all, their teachers aren't unionized, for example. So I think that there are a lot of factors that the charter school movement seems to be tapping into: parent choice, concerns about public schools, hope for more innovation, more technology usage. But certainly in the case of Washington, you can definitely see that the folks who are supportive of the charter school petition are certainly deeply involved in the technology industry, which I think should give us pause as to whether or not what this innovation actually means.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I had not made that connection. But a lot of these articles about non-educational philanthropy show the direct ties between the foundations and their commercial partners.
Right.
And how the philanthropy often seems to be guiding the profitability of the partner organization.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that this is, I think that there are, in the case of education in particular, there seems to be a lot of movement between folks who are at Microsoft, folks who then move to the Gates Foundation, then move to the Department of Ed, then back to the Gates Foundation. So it doesn't actually seem to be entities that are sort of divorced from one another. And this isn't to say that the Gates Foundation or the Department of Ed are necessarily promoting a Microsoft agenda, but the ties are certainly close between these among these organizations in terms of personnel, if not in terms of mission.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm glad to hear there's no investment bubble in ed tech. Certainly,
Right.
I'm greatly comforted by that. Right.
Greatly comforted, right? I mean, this last year, only $9 million was invested in education, and the highest year, the year pre internet pre internet bubble last time, it was 13 million. So certainly we're seeing a great deal of investor restraint. Nobody is throwing money at silly ideas these days.
Is that satire or
That's
snarkiness
snark.
or wait a minute?
I don't know.
So this is interesting because bubbles pop,
Yes.
and it seems that this is like watching a train wreck in slow motion. I mean, the expectation for returns are not likely to come, and so a lot of these ventures are typically going to fold, right?
That I think so. I mean, and it is the GSV advisors report is a pretty interesting read for some of these nuggets that it doesn't actually tout. But looking back at some of those 1999 numbers, the companies that were really hailed as being the game changers in education technology, many of them do not even exist any longer. Or if they had, or in the case of someone like Blackboard, they had their IPO, but now they're owned again by a private equity firm, and it does feel as though we're seeing such exuberance right now with investors' interest in education technology. Indeed, the report says that education is the area that investors are most excited about. That it, that these investments aren't necessarily thoughtful. They aren't necessarily in products that are effective, and I think just in terms of market, these aren't necessarily products that are going to be profitable. And you do have to wonder if, when things pop, if we'll be faced again with the same arguments that we had, 5 or 6 years ago, that nobody wants to invest in education technology, nobody wants to build education technology companies because education is intractable and it's just not a place to make money.
Okay, you be snarky and I'll be sarcastic.
Okay, it's a
We can
deal.
we can divide our roles that way. So, tell me about this bar exam idea.
Yeah, this is. Ooh, okay. I'm being what? I'm being snarky. Okay. So this week the Aspen Ideas Festival occurred, and this is one of those wonderful events where the elite of the world gather and sort of pat themselves on the back for their revolutionary ideas. Interesting this year that someone extended an invitation to AFT President Randy Weingarten, who's, I think, perhaps most famous as the villain in Waiting for Superman. But she spoke about, and I should say that typically the reunions in a lot of these conversations are painted as the problem with education. So it was really interesting to see her on stage at this event offer her big idea for changing education and suggest that we should have a bar exam for teachers, that would be a way to ensure that teachers were highly qualified and to, and she said, replace a system of certification that was too complicated, too old-fashioned, and not adequately assessing whether or not a teacher was ready and able to teach.
I'm sure we could spend a lot of time on that. Is there any value in that idea?
Well, I think that it is interesting to think about to look at the certification processes, which vary greatly from city to city and state to state. What do you have to do in order to become a teacher? Some states have really high and complicated, convoluted certification processes. Others don't. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure why a bar exam would be the model that we would find useful for either simplifying this or for actually being an indicator of who is a good teacher. Certainly, passing the bar exam doesn't make you a good lawyer. And so I think, to me, it seems that we're so obsessed with this testing, this sort of testing regime it strikes me as odd that would be the place that Weingarten would go to suggest a way out of the current problems with recruiting and keeping teachers.
I'll tell you what I liked about it. I liked the idea of an independent professional effort that would
Mm-hmm.
remove the teacher pedagogical certification issues from the public political sphere.
Yes.
I mean, maybe I went the wrong direction on that, but it occurred to me that, again, I'm so disappointed. When we look at our prison policy and sort of how badly that's gone, and the idea that education is a public, it's not a, that's the wrong word, that it's a political
Right.
pawn
Mm-hmm.
means that it's very hard to have a professional body really do a good job of kind of raising the bar.
I think that yeah, I think that that's a good point. And I was thinking too about I had to look and see exactly what the bar exam entails, and because it's not. I mean, I'm not sure that there are in terms of just the what you're asked on a bar exam, a set of multiple choice questions, of course, essays. But there's a section on ethics, and although I think I was sort of struck with thinking what are the ethics, what would the opportunities be to have to think about teaching and ethics. Of course, ethics in the law and ethics in teaching are two totally different things. But I thought that would be an interesting thing to think about. But I'm nervous about any calls for more testing. Again, because I think the good folks at Pearson and the College Board are just primed to benefit greatly in ways that I'm not sure that the profession or that kids would benefit.
Good perspectives. So I actually took a computer science course at Stanford University in 1982, and my lack of success in that course is directly equated to my not being a top management at Intel or Microsoft or somewhere else. But this is now the largest major on campus.
I think this is really interesting in a number of ways. I mean, on one hand, it's not surprising. Stanford sits at the heart of Silicon Valley, so it's not shocking to hear that the school is churning out more computer science majors than any other. What I thought was interesting was the statistic that 90% of Stanford students, take at least one CS course. That to me is indicative. I mean, again, it's indicative of this sort of atmosphere of high tech, but that's really quite different than I would venture to guess most other institutions for which computer science isn't something that people would even think about taking. But the school is actually looking to rethink and redesign the degree and the curriculum, which is interesting because I think partially because of what does it mean to create what does a CS major have to know in a world where the discipline is changing, the content is changing so rapidly, and do you give everybody or almost everyone at Stanford an introduction to computational thinking in a way that's useful to them in their own disciplines. And so I think it'll be interesting to watch how Stanford approaches how they approach this.
So I'm going to use another S word here, and the word is suspicion. And I'm intrigued at how sort of uniquely suspicious my kids are of any network or site that purports to be bringing teenagers certain social media technologies. They like to find something on their own and build it with their friends, and they actually respond to anything that seems to be directed at them as teenagers. So tell us about Waywire, and is it really directed at teenagers?
It is directed at teens and young adults, and I must say that I wonder too about this notion of sort of build it and they will come platforms that are directed at teens, particularly when this is a media company that's co-founded by Newark Mayor Cory Booker, who is a champ at Twitter, I must say. But it's interesting to think about why we are always concerned with building separate things, separate places for young kids to be on the internet. If Waywire is indeed a little bit Facebook and a little bit Twitter, then the case has to be really good, and a little bit YouTube, I should add. The case has to be really good why teens wouldn't want to use Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. And I'm not sure that there's anything there in Waywire that would make someone to not use YouTube and instead to use this new platform.
Well, I went to the site, and all I could do is put my email address in. So we've given them more publicity than I would want for a site where I can't actually see anything. But I am curious, and I'm sure we'll watch that play out.
Yes.
Audrey, for a holiday week, you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Produced a lot of great content. We'll talk next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.